see it for themselves, to ask questions. And if no one gets there, then that will be a time to say, well, here's what I think that this is getting at, and then you can explain, but providing the opportunity for them to interact first is always important. We want to have people meaningfully engage with the biblical content, and we also want to do that in a way that guides discussion rather than just tells them what they need to see. So yes, all the better, and what we want more than anything is for people to come to biblical conclusions on their own. And so that's the goal. Yes, other things here we've already kind of talked about, so I'm going to keep going. So getting into leading discussion. The next thing that I have in your notes that I want to just talk about a little bit is the type of questions that we can ask when we are leading discussion. It's important to just know in advance that you're not going to remember everything that we're going to talk about right now when you're leading discussion. But it's helpful to think about these things in advance so that you begin to have categories for how to lead discussion, especially as discussion gets going. Some of this you can plan in advance, some you can't. Some you just need to learn how to grow, or you need to grow in asking good questions. And so the point of this is to get at, okay, what are good questions that we can ask? And then we'll end with the particular article on types of questions that we shouldn't ask. And so this material here actually comes from a gal named Amy Jackson, who was something of a communications director at I think at Northwestern University, but she was helping with putting together small group material, and some of this most of this is coming from her specific material. So I just want to be very clear on that. I did not come up with this stuff myself. So these are things that she said, and one of the things that she says at the beginning is in terms of asking good questions, nobody does this perfectly right off the bat, but everybody grows in time. The more you do it, the more you get a feel for it. And she also says at the same time that these are tips, that as you think about them and process through them and then begin implementing them, that's how you begin growing and doing it. So a lot of this is going to be growing through practice. The first types of questions are really easy to get, and they're just launching questions. She says these questions are intended to get discussion started, focusing the group members' attention on a certain topic. They should be open-ended and engaging. And the examples that she has is, what role did the Bible have in your childhood home? When have you experienced forgiveness? What was it like? This can be helpful in a few different ways. One is the first time your group gets together, just asking a launching question. I think our first group meeting when we met back last year was, I think I asked everybody, how did you come to know Christ? Or how have you grown most in your Christian life? Or what are ways you still want to grow? Which was really interesting, because as we went around, almost everybody said evangelism in terms of ways that they want to still grow. And so sometimes that can just be a way of understanding, maybe we should do a study on evangelism at some point. And so launching questions can be along those lines. They don't necessarily have to be at the beginning of every study, though. It just depends on your group. Some group leaders like to do this, where like she mentions, if you're going to get into a topic on forgiveness, you might begin by asking a broad question in general about forgiveness, just to get people's appetite whetted. So those are launching questions. The next type of questions are observation questions. She says these are the only true closed questions you'll use. They seek to clarify what the text says. They ask group members simply to look to the text for the answer. So what does she mean by closed questions?
They have a specific answer.
Exactly. You're just making observations. They're not like some of the later ones where you're reflecting, you're processing, you're applying. These are just trying to get people to see what's there. The example she gives in these verses, what does Paul say is necessary for salvation? What Old Testament characters are mentioned in this passage from Hebrews? And so the goal here is to get people, get their bearings in the truth. And so what is the consequence? Like if we don't ever do this, what could be a negative consequence?
Could be some, like, because in the 4 types of questions not to ask, those are the Captain Obvious questions. that she says not to do.
Right, so we're gonna need to talk about
But-
that.
But it could be, especially if you've got differing levels of people in your group, it could be some pretty obvious things that are missed by some if you don't kind of throw some, just a few observation questions out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that that's true. I think also, if our goal is always be people of the Word, getting our bearings in what the text says will sometimes be essential. Because sometimes it's just really easy when you're talking and having a discussion about something, where you're immediately beginning to think about application, but you haven't spent enough time really observing what the text says first. And so spending time in observation will be important at times. Now again, I think there's bad ways of doing that. We'll talk about that later.
I think too,
Yeah.
the leading a core group, now these are teenagers, so it's different than than leading adults who might be more versed in Bible study, but I felt like some of the observation questions is helping them learn just how to be observant.
Yeah.
We all, at some point in our Christian life, just need to learn how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, being a careful Bible reader is a good thing. And observing stuff in the text that helps get to legitimate meaning and application is important. And so I think that that's good. Interpretation questions. These questions ask how, why, or what do you think. They require group members to consider the meaning of the text using their own experiences and perspectives. So how are these different from observation questions?
They're, well, like it says, it's interpretive. It's how has it affected you, and what do you glean from this? And that could be different from individual to individual based upon how you came to the meeting.
Yeah.
You know, if you came to the meeting having received Christ in this setting or that setting, your interpretation might differ somewhat. And you have to understand that those are not definitive answers, those are just interpretive answers. And, you know, however, there are some interpretive answers that are clearly designed to show where your theology is correct or wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so, like, for example, taking a Bible text like John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, whoever believes in Him will not perish but have eternal life. You know, like an observation question is, you know, who did God give? His only Son. Who did God give His Son for? For the world. And so, like, and then you get into, like, well, what's the purpose of it all? Like, those are all observation questions. Getting into, like, meaning interpretation questions. Why does it matter that God gave His Son for the world? Like, what does that mean? What's that communicating? It shows God's love, right? What does it mean that God gave His Son for the world? Why is that important? And so just observing that it's the world is one thing. Getting into what it means, those are interpretation questions. And so understanding more of, you know, the depths of God's love. There's other examples here too. Why do you think Jesus said that to Peter? You know, like observation would be whatever Jesus said to Peter. You know, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Like, you could ask the obvious observation question is, what did He say? The interpretation question is, why do you think He said that? What does it mean to bear with one another? That would be another example of an interpretation question. So, all right, next type of question would be reflection questions. These questions seek to make the transition between our understanding of what the text says and its implications for our lives. They transition from interpretation questions to application questions. They ask the question, what does this have to do with us? Or why was this included in the Bible? And so, for example, back to John 3:16. A reflection question would be along the lines of, do we tend to live in the knowledge of the Father's love for us? Do we tend to live in the knowledge that we are those of the world that needed to be saved by the sending of Christ's Son? So yeah, do we realize enough that we're part of the same sinful world as people down the street that are perhaps, in a worldly sense, could be considered more sinful than we are? Do we realize that we're just as sinful as them? Like, those would all be reflection questions getting into the text. Other examples here. Why do you think we so rarely talk in church about sex? What might it look like to care for orphans and widows today? If Jesus talks so much about money, why do we talk about it so infrequently in the church? Those are just good questions. It makes you want to have a discussion about those things. But those come from different places in the Bible. In James, number 2 has to do with James. Pure and unadulterated religion is this, caring for orphans and widows. The reflection question is, what does that look like? How do we do that? And so getting into those types of questions are good foster discussion. Application questions then flow from those. As you begin reflecting on those types of things, these questions help group members take what they've learned and apply it on a personal level. Having discovered the life-changing principles in the text, group members consider what their response will be. This is where you get personal. What is your response to, what should your response to this ought to be? Examples given. What changes will you make this week because of our discussion on the creation story? Or, if you're going through the spiritual disciplines, what's one spiritual discipline you'll commit to this month? When will you practice this discipline? So those would be specific application. How is this going to change what you are doing in your life now? If you're getting into something on prayer, then you begin thinking, well, how are you going to begin to grow in prayer even this week? If you're talking about bearing with one another, once you've talked about what it means, you can then say, what are ways you can bear with your spouse this week? Those would be application questions that draw us into how we can apply in very concrete ways the Word to our lives. The last ones here are guiding questions. She writes that even though I placed these last, use these questions throughout the discussion to keep the discussion moving and to draw out the main ideas shared. These questions seek to summarize and clarify to keep the discussion focused. You can also use these questions to refocus the group when the discussion has gone off on a tangent. These are not questions that you can prepare. These are questions that you should keep in your mind and get better at in terms of guiding the discussion. For example, are we saying that? Why did you mean, or what did you mean when you said that? It's ways of keeping the focus where you're at and guiding discussion as things come up. And in many ways, these are the types of questions that will probably be most important to continuing discussion going, because they're going to be reactionary to how people are talking about different things, and you're going to be helping to guide discussion through that. Any questions before we get to the last thing that she says here? Any thoughts on any of those things thus far? Any questions? Application questions? The last thing that she says is that she talks about the 30-second rule. She writes, too often leaders ask a question, wait 3 to 5 seconds, and then jump in to answer it themselves. Instead, always wait 30 seconds after asking a question. How do you guys feel about that? No, I didn't come up with that. Sorry. Very, very few things that I ever say did I come up with.
As a teacher, I struggle with it.
Yeah.
You want to keep the lesson moving, but just gotta remember that you've been doing this for like a long time, and they need a little more processing time.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, and when we think about why we should do this, that's one of the reasons why. Allowing people to process. Sometimes we can, because when you're leading, you don't want to feel the awkwardness of the silence. And it's been said that extroverts struggle with this a lot more than introverts. You guys knew that. Extroverts struggle with the silence, whereas introverts maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with it. Yeah, right? Am I getting that backwards?
So good.
Yeah. And so that there can be a temptation when you're leading, where if nobody's, like you can begin thinking, maybe I asked a bad question, or maybe people just think this is a stupid question.
Or you could say, I'm gonna give you time to think about this.
Yep.
You know, I'll wait for about 30 seconds.
Yep.
Somebody, tell them,
Yep.
now they're on the clock.
Yeah.
And it doesn't become so awkward.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is when it does feel like a little bit awkward, that may provoke some people to answer the question who perhaps didn't. Ryan Wanzer once told me, he's like, Zach, when you ask questions in Sunday school, I almost always have like an answer in my head. I just don't feel like saying anything. And I'm like, thanks for letting me know that, Ryan. I'll call on you next time. So, but I think that that's probably true for a lot of people. Like they have something on their mind, they're just a little bit hesitant to say anything. And when you allow for time to go by, eventually somebody will say something.
Well, and some people acknowledge the fact that maybe they do talk too much, and they need to let other people
Yep.
say things too.
Yep, absolutely.
That's good.
Yeah. She also goes on, this is similar to what Matt said. She said it takes at least 20 seconds for many people to process questions, especially questions that synthesize information like reflection and application questions. If they're not pre-planned questions that you like send out before or part of a Bible study, people may just not be able to answer application questions on the spot. They may need a little bit of time, and so giving people time to think through that can be helpful. So yeah, this a lot of things within this, as mentioned, will take place as you prepare questions in advance. But as we think about these types of questions, they can help shape the way that we guide discussion, and even the type of questions that we might prepare in advance if that's what we're doing. And like I said, there's some Bible studies that have pre-planned questions, but for me anyway, a lot of times, with the exception of a few, I almost always modify the questions or add like one or two things to them. So if there's a Bible study I've used with pre-planned questions, and it's asking something that I feel like is too broad, I might make it a little bit more specific. And so having these type of things in mind when you are planning to just lead the group in discussion can be helpful. And then also, the better we get at this, it'll become more natural to do on the spot. When somebody answers a particular question, but they didn't really get at application, even though it's an application question, and so you might have something about, well, I think I want them to apply that more. And so instead of just saying, answering for them, you follow up with a question that then gets them to think a little bit harder. So having these things in mind in advance helps with that. Any thoughts before we get into Melissa Kruger's article? All right. I didn't abide by the 30-second rule there, but I trust you guys would have said something sooner.
I could throw something in if you want something.
Yeah, I do. I want something,
Okay.
Matt.
Leading the tactics study, like the main point of that is honestly it's evangelism tactics, but it's just it's pretty much questions based. It's just asking, so what do you mean by that? That's the focus almost. So just a lot of power in your questions, and you better at making those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I was thinking through a lot of these things too, especially this one, I was like seeing things that I do that I shouldn't do,
Me too.
and things that I do that I should do
Things
better.
that you do that you shouldn't do.
Some of the questions, this is from, did you point out the doo-doo? That's awesome. But, yeah, like a Bible study, it'll be a question, it's like, I think that's the Captain Obvious question,
Yep.
but we just answer real fast. And
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just teasing. You just do so much more reading than I do.
Well, it is. Like, this is why it's good to do stuff like this and reflect, because everybody needs to grow, and we should want to grow, and it's good. It's good to process through things and do that. So, good. Well, so getting into these 4 types of questions not to ask in your small group Bible study. She just says some helpful things in the beginning, in the introduction of the article, and she gets in at the end of that introduction saying, we've all experienced the awkward moment when small groups go silent. Teachers have done their homework. They may know all the ins and outs of the theological landscape behind the passage being studied, or of the passage being studied, yet something is missing. We can make or break a small group time together, or what can make it or break a small group time together often has less to do with what teachers know and more to do with what they ask. And I think that that's true. And so that's what we want to do, and here are some things not to do. And the first one are the Captain Obvious questions. So Emily, what are the Captain Obvious questions?
The ones that are just kind of straight answers from the text. You almost feel silly answering it because you're like, could it really be this easy?
Like, what are you not seeing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I've definitely done that before, and probably will again. Sorry guys, but I think that it's helpful to think along these lines when she says at the end what to do instead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where she says instead of saying who are the 3 people Paul interacted with in the city of Philippi, describe the 3 people Paul interacted with in the city of Philippi. What's the difference?
You'll spot them, but then it's like, and what? Like, there's just more to look for.
Yeah.
A little deeper.
Yeah, it forces people to think about it and actually gets them into the text rather than just asking a Captain Obvious question. So yeah, that I think that's a very helpful thing to be aware of. One word wonders. What are these?
Doesn't need any explanation. It says it's just yes or no. I call it the children's
Yeah.
children's,
Sunday
you know,
school,
the
yeah.
question. you
Sure.
know. What's the
God.
answer? Bible,
Yeah.
Jesus, God, you know,
Yeah.
it's that.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes we can ask questions that are just like yes or no questions.
Yeah.
Or like you said, you don't even necessarily realize the way you worded it is
Mhm.
a one-word wonder until it's answered and you're
Right.
like, oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
I guess we're moving on to the next one.
Yeah. So and sometimes like it can be part of like the next thing you're trying to get. Does this mean this? No. Okay, well what does this mean? You know, like it can be helpful to progress in a particular way. But other times, yeah, it can also be part of making people feel awkward. And it can also be like no, we all know that. Do you think that we're dumb? And so yeah, just in general.
But sometimes I'm just thinking now when you were just saying that,
Yeah.
for a person that maybe isn't a big discussion person in there, and
Yeah.
a simple yes or no, then with, you know, like,
Yeah.
okay, Mary says, you know, she's finally said, no, you know, that's not it, and then almost, I don't wanna say put her on the spot, but like, well, why would you, you know, why do you say that, then to follow up, might be a way to
Engage them a little bit more.
engage
Yeah.
something a little bit.
Right.
There are times that as the group comes in with a dynamic that is unique to that day's setting because of the events that's gone on. Some days people are more chatty, some days
Yeah.
they're just not. We talk to our son, we ask him, how are things going? Okay. That was an open